Okay, good morning. Let me start by saying that there's a very nice line in a book by R.F. Mackenzie, an acclaimed book called A Search for Scotland, which often flits through my head. And he says at one point, the Scottish cultural revolution would begin in the country places. And I quite often think about that line because I think he's right. I think in many ways, the significant changes in Scotland are going to come from rural areas. And that's why I'm so delighted to be speaking here today at this first Scottish Rural Parliament. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about well-being rather than confidence, and in rural areas. But I want to start by saying why I'm so committed to highlighting the great work that's happening in rural areas. And I think one of the reasons why I've probably come to prominence at the moment for rural issues is because I'm editing a series of books called Postcards from Scotland, and there's a leaflet on your table if you're interested in just looking at what they are, because what this is doing is really saying to Scotland, we need to start changing the way that we live and the way that we think because of major environmental issues apart from anything else, and because our culture really isn't sustainable. So far, we've published 7 books with Argyll Publishing, and they're short books. One of the attractive things about the series is that they're 2 hours. They're about a 2-hour read. They're about 120 pages, and so they are incredibly accessible. And what's happening in rural areas has actually been really at the core of what we've been doing in a lot of the books, or we've been picking issues that are of incredible significance to rural areas. So, for example, in After Now, the first book in the series, which is on health, the very visionary thinker Phil Hanlon, who's a professor of public health, looks at some of the health challenges for Scotland, along with Sandra Carlyle, one of his research assistants. And he's looking at modernity, how there are major problems in the way that we're living, and that's translating into health issues. And he comes up at the end with 2 kind of projects that he particularly favours, and one of them, the most significant of the 2, is the Well Project in Nairn, which is a major and important way of dealing with health in patients in a really innovative way. So that's the first book in the series, and already rural Scotland is leading the way. The third book in the series is called The New Road, and I think it's relevant. We've already heard The New Road. Now, I was very, very keen to have something in this series that was charting the fantastic community work that was happening, particularly in rural Scotland, that we are not reading in the papers. Papers are declining, they don't have the budgets to send people out, they're not covering it. So unless you live in some of these areas with these fantastic projects, you often don't know about them. But I had an immediate problem with this because there's no money in small books. I didn't have a budget to commission a journalist to write it up. And then I suddenly realized that I was living with a semi-retired journalist, Alf Young, who used to write for the Herald and the Scotsman, and who was very good at actually taking something that could be quite dry and making it interesting. And I don't know that I would have interested him in it if it hadn't been for the fact that our son, Ewan Young, was at that point working in the Ullapool Development Trust. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if they did a father-son thing? And it's the road, but it's not that dystopian road of a man and his son going on a horrible journey. It's actually an inspiring journey. And so we talked about it. Ewan planned the journey. Alf did most of the writing. And they did an 8-day road trip around Scotland. Not the whole of Scotland, and they could easily have written 3 volumes of this. They were very aware of this. They started in Dunbar, they finished in Neudark, they went to 15 projects, 2/3 of them, maybe even more, in small town or rural Scotland. And they were blown away by what they saw in most of these areas. The commitment of people, the innovation, the fact that this is the way in which we're going to have to live more in the future, with people doing things about environmental sustainability, social enterprise, but also people doing things more for themselves. I'm very delighted to say, of the books in the series, that's the one that's proved most popular, because people are inspired when they read about the kind of things that people are doing. There's also a book in the series which is very, very relevant to rural Scotland called Scotland's Local Food Revolution by Mike Small. And this is an analytical book that looks at our dysfunctional food system, but also looks at a lot of the things that are happening in Scotland. When he proposed that title to me, I thought he was exaggerating. By the end of it, I was really convinced that there was a lot of very significant things happening in Scotland around local food, a lot of fantastic projects, initiatives, cafes, restaurants, and many of them are in rural Scotland. There's one on allotments, might not be as relevant to rural areas as urban areas, but actually there's a wonderful introduction to it which sets out why something like allotments or contact with a green environment, community gardens and so on, are so good for people's well-being. And the latest book in the series is Schooling Scotland, Education, Equity and Community by Danny Murphy. Now, Danny was so inspired by the new road, he decided he wanted to do his own road trip. And he went round about 10 projects in Scotland. And again, at least half of them, if not more, are in rural Scotland. But he couldn't then quite fit it into a book of 120 pages and then say anything else. So he's done it as an online tour journal. And one of the projects is about Room 13. And I'm sure many of you do not know about this wonderful education project called Room 13, which started in Cowell Primary School outside of Fort William. It's a creativity and enterprise project that has now spawned international projects in Turkey, in Nepal, several in Africa. This is a hugely significant thing that happened in a small rural school as a result of the teacher and the pupils. So, Room 13, do look at it because it's genuinely inspiring. So there's no doubt that rural Scotland, with a fraction of the population, we heard Richard Lochhead say a fifth, of urban Scotland, is exceeding expectations when it comes to innovative and important work. This needs to be recognised and celebrated, and this Rural Parliament is incredibly well placed to do that. And even just the Rural Innovation Awards last night, I learned about projects that I didn't know about, and I'm sure that would have been true for you as well. So there's a really important role because of the decline of the media, we're not getting access to that information, and we need it. We need to be doing it for ourselves. But I want to move on and talk a bit about well-being, because rural areas, particularly in Scotland, are also leading on well-being. And these are no idle words, because we've got confirmation from that from the UK's government decision to measure well-being, often called in the press Cameron's happiness measures. Now, there have been 3 annual surveys taking 165,000 people a year throughout the UK and giving them questions on what's called subjective well-being. So these are questions trying to measure people's happiness, their life satisfaction, whether they feel their life is worthwhile. This is often reported in the papers as whether people think they're worthwhile, as if it's a kind of self-esteem question. It's not. This is about whether you think your life is worthwhile, and it's about how meaningful you think your life is. There's a subtle difference between the two. And the 4th question relates to anxiety. It's asking people on a scale how anxious they felt yesterday. Now, the results show that over the 3 years, of the 4 constituent parts of the UK, Northern Ireland has the best subjective well-being. Scotland second, significantly ahead of England and Wales. Results have varied a bit from year to year, but for 2 of the 3 years, the area of the UK with the best well-being ratings and these subjective well-beings across the board was Elanshire, Orkney and Shetland. Also performing well, the Scottish Highlands, Dumfries and Galloway, particularly on happiness and low on anxiety, the Scottish Borders, Perth and Kinross, Moray and Aberdeenshire. Scottish rural areas are doing very well when it comes to well-being. The last results in September, Northern Ireland actually demoted Scotland from the top. They took 4 of the 5 top places, with a place in Suffolk taking the other one. And it was places like Antrim and Fermanagh that came top. It's maybe fortunate. Jean Urquhart, many of you will know, the MSP, and myself were thinking about putting together a book with her as editor called Lessons from the North, which would have been exactly looking at why the north of Scotland was leading the way in well-being, but actually maybe it's just as well we didn't make progress on it since it's now the north of Ireland. Other places that do well are Anglesey, the Isle of Wight, Cornwall, East Devon, Somerset and Suffolk. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no people in rural areas who are languishing or not doing well in terms of well-being. Of course there are. And you will know this. You will know that there are people who are isolated, who don't have access to services that would make a difference to them and so on. But proportionately, there are fewer of them in rural areas than there are in urban areas. The places with the lowest life satisfaction and happiness and the highest anxiety in general are urban areas like London, Slough, Glasgow, Liverpool. Edinburgh, which scores high on life satisfaction, actually scores quite high on anxiety. Some of the most unhappy areas are South Ayrshire, the Welsh Valleys, places of industrial decline. And other areas with low well-being are those with urban deprivation. But what's interesting about this is it's well-off urban areas that do not come out particularly well in well-being. And you wouldn't given the values of our culture, you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that, because we're always being told that the route to happiness is money. The area in the UK with the lowest well-being, particularly high anxiety, often have the highest disposable income. Now, what's interesting about these figures is that the top performing areas are not only rural, but they're mainly coastal, so that the islands are doing particularly well. So, what is it about living in these areas that is so good for people's well-being? Now, there's been a certain amount of speculation, there's some indicative research and so on. The most obvious answer is they are made up of people who tend to score high on well-being. White people tend to do better than people from other ethnic groups. Married people tend to score better than single or divorced people, and people who are employed tend to score much better than people who are unemployed. So it could be, it's just a combination of these are the people in rural areas, but it's not just that. There are other factors as well. So what are they? Now, I'm going to start with my own hypothesis, because there is no definitive answer. There's only speculation and a bit of indicative research. My own hypothesis is that these places are quite literally the furthest away from materialist culture and values. Now, I'm particularly interested in this because my book for the series is called The Great Takeover: How Materialism, the Media and Markets Now Dominate Our Lives. And if we think about materialism as the pursuit of money and what it can buy, image and appearance, fame, popularity and status, these are materialist values, and they dominate so much now of Western culture, and they are very, very prevalent in the UK. They are the values of celebrity culture. They're what you're getting all the time from the media. Now, what's really interesting is there's extensive research which shows that the more people pursue these values in life, the worse their well-being is. Materialist values make people more unhappy, dissatisfied, and anxious. It's not difficult to see why, if you think that your life is dependent on getting the latest mobile phone or fashions or whatever, you're not going to be satisfied for very long because someone's going to get a better model. And dissatisfaction is just the whole part of the system. It's what advertising thrives on. So if that's your agenda in life, you can see why your well-being's not likely to be very good. The other thing is, these values take us away from the things in life that really do make a difference for well-being, particularly relationships, a sense of meaning and purpose. It's these sorts of things that really matter for people's well-being. So if these are your values, you're really unlikely to be staying in a rural area because you're not going to be able to satisfy them very much. Now, of course, there are other reasons as well. I think probably a contact with some culture that's different from that. And I think we saw that displayed last night with the Gaelic choir. People in rural areas have often got access to different culture and contact with them from these kind of materialist cultural values that are so dominant. And that could be incredibly beneficial. But there are other reasons, and one of them is contact with the green environment. There's a man called Theodore Roszak, who's considered the father of what's now called the eco-psychology movement. And there's a lovely quote from him when he says, "When highly stressed people are asked to visualize a soothing scene, nobody imagines a freeway or shopping mall. Rather, images of wilderness, forest, seascape, and starry skies invariably emerge." There's now a lot of psychologists and thinkers arguing that contact with the green world is imperative for people's well-being. There's a best-selling author who wrote a book called Last Child in the Woods, a guy called Richard Louv, who talks about nature deficit disorder. There's numerous empirical research projects now which show that if people have contact with nature, they are more likely to lead a healthy lifestyle. Walking in a green environment, not an urban environment, has been shown to have a calming effect on people, improving their attention and their memory, boosting mood, and helping prevent depression. This is why professionals are now talking about green therapy. Nature and contact with nature has a restorative effect on people. It helps de-stress people. And this is why there is likely to be lower anxiety in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And of course, another reason is it's easier in a rural area to have a sense of community. You have to. We're social beings. We now know that loneliness is as big a killer of people as smoking is. We need other people. And if you're living in a kind of remote rural area, you know instinctively that you have to make more of an effort. And so probably you are more drawn to community. Now, what I've learned over the years in running the centre I run is that well-being is quite an elusive thing because it consists of a balancing act between a sense of belonging and a sense of being recognized and respected as an individual and having the opportunity for individual self-expression. And the wonderful thing about community organizations is that they can give people that. They can recognize their talents, their capabilities, who they are as an individual, but at the same time have that sense of belonging. So, very quickly to sum up then, because I'm running out of time. To paraphrase R.F. Mackenzie, rural areas will provide much of the catalyst for making Scotland better. Not only are you already involved in doing a lot of these things, but you're leading the way on well-being. Scotland has to pay attention to what you're doing. The Rural Parliament will provide a great voice for you to do that. I hope you use it and you use it loudly. Thank you.